India is said to be the biggest democracy in the world. A silent power in search of the strong person who will give it its rightful place and achieve harmony between its tradition and modernity. With a population of 1.3 billion, soon to overtake China, and as the world's fifth largest economic power, 21st century India is a rapidly changing monster, striving for modernization to reduce inequalities and become a record-breaking country. With the second largest army in the world and its pivotal position between China and the West in terms of nuclear power, India is today claiming a place amongst the world's strategic military powers. After a century of English colonization, after independence won by peaceful means in 1947 by Gandhi and his right-hand man, Nehru, and after 60 years of rule by the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty, a man of the people coming from the opposition took power in India in 2014 with the promise of a new beginning. Narendra Modi, a right-wing nationalist, is the new strongman of India and the planet, the third most followed politician in the world on Twitter.
Modi he's a larger-than-life figure. He has been consummate in his image-making.
I'm a self-made man. My father used to sell tea, my mother used to clean houses. I'm a lower caste man. Put me in the Prime Minister's office, I'll create 20 million jobs.
Modi is looking to take revenge on history, to give back to India its original purity and its central place in world order.
India is going to reclaim her history from its glory days when there were no Muslims, when there were no British, we were all Hindu and we were glorious.
Modi seemed like the strong leader that was going to help make India proud to be Indians again.
और भाइयों बहनों, दुनिया की कोई ताकत नहीं है कि 125 करोड़ के देश को रोक सके भाइयों। 21वीं सदी हिंदुस्तान की सदी बनाना है।
Je souhaite que la France soit votre premier partenaire stratégique en Europe et plus largement en Occident.
Modi is at the center of a new alliance with the West against a common enemy.
India is handled carefully in order to find a counterbalance with China.
For a long time, we saw India as an impoverished nation, a place where the West sent aid, the place of Mahatma Gandhi, where you learned how to do yoga, a spiritual place. But it's actually much more than that. It's developed in the last decade into one of the world's superpowers.
He called himself a chowkidar, and the word means a gatekeeper, a protector, a guardian.
He is a person of tremendous energy, perhaps the best orator in Hindi that the country has seen in living memory. But when you look at the message and the values that he stands for, they're frightening.
Never before was India so powerful on the international stage. Never before was India so nationalistic and authoritarian in its interior politics. Who is Narendra Modi? This is the story of a turning point for India and the world. To understand Modi, we need to go to the sacred town of Kedarnath in the heart of the Himalayas in the north of India. This is where he was initiated into the power of the Hindu religion, and where he habitually comes to communicate with his followers in the most important moments of his life. Because Modi is above all a fervent believer. Like 80% of Indians, he prays to the Hindu gods.
India is a country where a large part of the population has some spiritual life. So he's picking up on that knowledge, but he does it at the scale where it can't just be meditation in his house, it has to be up in the Himalayas where the gods live.
For the cameras which follow him, Modi presents himself as a wise man, a guide for India and the world.
Modi as a guru implies that he's some sort of spiritual leader. Now, in that sense, Narendra Modi as Prime Minister teaches through example. He's by who he is, what he does, what he says, what he eats, when he fasts. He's an exemplar of what people should aspire to be, and people are wowed by it.
I asked him one question that you have come up with many innovative schemes. So he said that I actually have God's gift.
To enhance his divine image, Modi is prepared to make any sacrifice. After a 22-kilometre walk to a height of 4,000 metres, he prepares for 17 hours of prayer.
He's the only man who loves solitude in the presence of a camera crew. If you look at that cave, there was a hook to hang up clothes that had already been put in place. It was like a 5-star cave. And he went there purely to radiate this image of himself as a Hindu ascetic. And that fits in so well with the cult of personality that he's sought to build for himself, which is unrivaled in the democratic world.
Like the Hindu gods, Narendra Modi has several faces. Behind the mask of pacifism, he has a mission to accomplish. Written in the 1920s by Savarkar, the Indian extreme right ideologist.
Savarkar developed an ideology that was born at the same time as the fascist and Nazi ideologies in the 1920s.
Savarkar was inspired by Mussolini. And what did Savarkar wrote in his book? He said that for a Muslim, for a Christian, India is not a holy land or a fatherland.
So their idea is to create the Indian nation in which Hindus are supreme and where all minorities are at best second-class citizens, but ideally should be removed from the body politic. This is the ideology that Prime Minister Modi believes in and has been part of.
It is this ideology which Modi has applied since he was re-elected in May 2019. A programme of national revenge aiming to restore India to the Hindus, the first act of which was the suppression of the autonomy of Indian Kashmir, a majority Muslim autonomous region disputed by India and Pakistan. In the summer of 2019, Modi began executing his programme with an initial show of strength. He ended the autonomy of Kashmir and installed a brutal curfew. In so doing, he attacked the most sensitive affair in the India-Pakistan region, which has become one of the most militarized zones in the world.
We fulfilled our promise, and history would remember Narendra Modi as one of the prime ministers who dared to implement the agenda which strengthens our republicanism.
There was the element of surprise. But once again, the populists who go out of their way to wrong foot those who still believe in playing by the rules are quite adept at this. It's their great strength. So you're surprised at being surprised when you knew all along that surprise was their objective. You outwit the opposition, the institutions, the observers.
To avoid a Kashmiri uprising, Modi's government deployed 80,000 soldiers and severed all means of communication.
The people of Kashmir have been put under complete lockdown for 4 months. Their internet has been suspended. People have been prevented from coming out, expressing themselves. And the stories of human tragedy are piling up. Some people have learned of the passing of their parents from friends who've travelled in from Kashmir. How could you do that to a place that you claim to be your own?
A great purge then began amongst opposition members, mainly Muslims. more than 4,000 people, politicians, militants and academics, were arrested.
What it has done is to push that whole region off the edge. Today, thousands of people are in jail, all the leaders, 3 chief ministers. There's no governance between the population and the army. There's nothing.
In deciding to arbitrarily occupy this autonomous territory, Modi ignited the anger of his Pakistani neighbour. The Prime Minister Imran Khan turned to the international community through the UN, demanding that an international commission of inquiry be set up.
And number one action must be that India must lift this inhuman curfew, which has lasted for 55 days. It must free all political prisoners, and especially those 13,000 boys that have been picked up. You were supposed to stop this happening.
The international community remained silent. It had other ideas concerning Modi's India. In August 2019, at the height of the Kashmir crisis, a G7 summit of world leaders, organised by France in Biarritz, rolled out the red carpet for the Indian leader, who it was hoping to include in its intimate circle. It was an opportunity for Modi to reinforce his image as a pacifist, which he cultivated internationally, along with his hug diplomacy.
When Modi is abroad, he plays Gandhi too. He says he loves peace. He believes in protecting the environment. You know, he says the most important thing to me is democracy.
Modi had made it clear before his arrival that he refused to discuss Kashmir. So during the press conference, the American president replied for him.
Well, we spoke last night about Kashmir, and the Prime Minister really feels he has it under control. I know they speak with Pakistan, and I'm sure that they will be able to do something that will be very good. He actually speaks very good English, we just don't want to talk about it.
The group of 7 world superpowers was urgently seeking to counter China's growing strength, and to this end, sought to create strong bonds with Modi, who could serve as a precious ally.
There were negative reactions from China and Pakistan, which was predictable enough. But notable absentees were from the West. The West let them get on with it. It was a sign that India was to be pandered to for easily understandable commercial reasons. India was seen as a market, a weapons market, but not only that.
To understand Narendra Modi's strength, we need to go back in India's history and the history of a man, retrace the tormented itinerary of the child from Gujarat. Narendra Modi was born in Vagnagar in the state of Gujarat in 1950. He was born into an India recently freed from British colonisation, thanks to 2 historic figures, Mahatma Gandhi and Nehru, his right-hand man. An India trying to reconquer its history, culture and identity after centuries of invasion and occupation. Modi was the 3rd of 6 children. His parents, from a modest caste, ran a grocery business. While still very young, Narendra worked with his father.
As a boy, I sold tea on trains. My mother did housework for others. I've seen poverty close up. It was even the first source of inspiration in my life. That's why I decided to live not for myself, but for others.
Legend has it that his father, who came from an oil presser caste, ran a tea stall on the platform of the local railway station, at which he himself served tea as a child. That's very important in the legend of Narendra Modi, because it means he is a self-made man. He managed to raise himself up, is therefore of the people and against the elites.
Like most of the youngsters from his village, Narendra Modi received training from volunteers of the paramilitary Hindu Nationalist organisation. The RSS, as it was called, took inspiration from European fascist movements and was created in 1925 under British colonisation to teach Hindus to assert and free themselves from foreign influences. Modi would get up at dawn every morning to strengthen his body and listen to patriotic speeches.
When he was 8, Prime Minister Modi joined the RSS, which is a nationalist Hindu organization. Some people say it's more like the Boy Scouts. It's a patriotic organization, and others would say it's a little bit darker than that.
At 7 or 8 years of age, it was mainly games which were proposed. You know, things like dodgeball. But at the same time, there was the idea of discipline behind it, because they were in uniform, black cap, white shirt, khaki shorts, and of course a lathi, the famous metal-tipped bamboo stick. This discipline also involved the handling of cold weapons, a sort of martial arts training.
The young Modi learned how to march, how to raise the flag, and also how to fight and defend Hindu values. Because for the nationalist paramilitary RSS, after the British occupation, the new enemy to be overthrown was the party in power, the Nehru-Gandhi Congress Party, considered too close to the former British colonialists and which had made the mistake of accepting the partition of the so-called British India into India and Pakistan.
There were also indoctrination sessions where the history of India was told, from the Golden Hindu Age, where Hindus were presented as being clearly the oldest people on earth. This idea became predominant as he grew up, and he would end up seeing the members of this organization as ideologists. Those who weren't ideologists left, and those who remained became ideologists. And that was his case. He devoted himself to the organization.
Modi was more attracted by the teachings of the Hindu nationalist paramilitary than by school, where he stood up to his teachers and forged his character. At the age of 15, in 1965, Modi wanted to leave school and join the Indian Army during the war against Pakistan. But his parents had other things in mind for him: an arranged marriage with a young girl of the same caste.
He was married off as a child. There's a tradition of child marriage in India, and his family found a girl for him, roughly the same age. They were married off, and when they were adults, they were supposed to come live together. He barely had any say in the matter.
Devastated by this forced marriage, Modi took a decision which was to change the course of his life. He decided to leave the family home and run off into the Himalayas.
He had no desire to consummate this marriage and live with his spouse, so he left. He abandoned his wife and set off on a spiritual quest, as he put it. He first went to Bengal, he crossed India from west to east, and then says he went into the Himalayas, where he lived as a hermit, an ascetic.
2 mysterious years went by, during which Modi notably met up with Hindu fundamentalists. He lived in the ashrams of sadhu monks, ascetics who had renounced the material lifestyle and questioned superficial Western culture. Modi was captivated by the purity of the Hindu religion.
I walked a lot in the Himalayas. I went to the ashram of Vivekananda in Almora. I turned towards spirituality, but at the same time, I was influenced by patriotism. It was a mixture. Impossible to separate the two.
Returning from his travels, Modi was sure of his destiny. To complete the synthesis between religion and ideology, it was the Hindu nationalist paramilitary, with whom he had trained since childhood, that he would marry. A new life began for him. At the age of 23 in 1973, Modi was introduced to the new supreme leader of the RSS, Dioras. The effect was immediate. Dioras became his mentor, his spiritual father. The radical leader passed on his fervour to Modi, along with the art of eloquence.
जिनका एकमात्र उद्देश्य किसी प्रकार संघ को नष्ट करना, इतना ही होगा। लेकिन बादल आए, बादल छट गए।
It was he who taught Modi the roots of the Hindu nationalist ideology, written by Savarkar and his successors. An ideology of revenge born from the wounds of Indian history, with British colonisation and before that the invasions of Muslims that ravaged and occupied India between the 10th and 15th centuries.
Hindu nationalism is a belated response to a phenomenon that has plagued India for a millennium, which is invasions by Islamic armies from Central Asia. So for 1 millennium, India was very repeatedly vandalized, plundered by armies that came in from across the western border. A great deal of heritage of India was destroyed during those raids, and a number of Hindus were massacred and forcibly converted to Islam.
Several hundred years later, in the 19th century, India was submitted to new violence and humiliation with British colonisation.
You know, the imperialism was the biggest curse on human civilization. Whether it was British imperialism or Portuguese imperialism, that enslaved the people. That was basically based on the premise that certain people are superior. In the name of civilizing mission, they exploited the resources and human beings. They changed your language, they imposed religion, and they degraded the indigenous people as backward, not civilized. They destroyed our own thinking.
Since India's independence in 1947, nationalists had dreams of taking their revenge by constructing a purely Hindu state on the sacred land of India's origins.
It is a very powerful message to send out to your supporters saying India is going to reclaim her history from its glory days when there were no Muslims, when there were no British, we were all Hindu and we were glorious. We had the best science, we had the best religion, we had all the knowledge the world needed. And we are going to reclaim that past.
Instructed by the greatest ideologists, Narendra Modi had now perfectly mastered the Hindu nationalist rhetoric. He could now begin to affirm his political ambitions. Modi became the go-to person in the Hindu party in New Delhi. From national secretary to spokesperson, he was increasingly in the media spotlight, ready for nationwide recognition. In 2002, at the height of the legislative election campaign, the party sent Modi to Gujarat, the state of his birth, to replace the weakened incumbent. At the age of 51, having spent 30 years in the shadow of his mentors, Modi decided to embrace the challenge. This time, he would need to orchestrate his own campaign. But hardly had he arrived when a tragic event shook his program. While travelling to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the destruction of the mosque in Ayodhya, 58 Hindu fundamentalists, men, women and children, perished in a fire aboard their train, which had stopped in a majority Muslim town. Hindus immediately accused Muslims of having set the train alight. Modi arrived to pay homage to the faithful.
Nobody is very clear about who lit that fire and how it happened. And then Modi just came to the front. You know, he ordered the burnt bodies to be brought to Ahmedabad and put on display for people to sort of express their grief.
The following day, violence broke out against the Muslim community, considered responsible for the tragedy. Modi did not intervene. Violent riots spread across Gujarat. More than 2,000 people, mainly Muslims, fell victim to pogroms.
What we know comes from the witness report of one of the police officers, Sanjeev Bhatt, who is currently in prison. He states that on or around the evening of the 27th of February, Narendra Modi summoned to his residence the head of the Gujarat government and the chiefs of police, telling them not to intervene for at least 3 days.
Excellent work they have done. Within 72 hours, we were able to control such a violence.
More than 500 people dead, most of them innocent civilians, and you're calling this excellent work?
I'm not happy what happened, but what we have done, I'm happy.
Mr. Modi realized that he suddenly discovered a gold mine, that out here was a hugely divisive state in society which could be harnessed politically. He decided to advance the elections. He realized that the riots and the division and the anti-Muslim sentiment which had been created in Gujarat because of that, he had an opportunity to harness a Hindu vote bank.
And in December, elections were held, and Modi won an absolute majority, with more than 50% of the votes, which is exceptional in India.
Modi had now found his campaign strategy and his electorate. But in India, as well as on the international scene, he represented hardline nationalism. The UK cut its ties with him, and he was forbidden from entering the United States for 10 years. To carry out his conquest of India and the world, Modi would have to soften his image and gain credit. Modi was passionate about new technology, which allowed him to establish a direct link with the people, such as holograms, which he was the first in the world to test.
For the first time in world's political history, Shri Narendra Modi created yet another benchmark when he took stage to address his audience via 3D hologram projection.
He beamed himself using holographic technology imported from England at astronomical cost, and people were mesmerized by that. And that itself was an indication to them of the fact that, my goodness, he's taking us so far into the future. And he lured voters with various promises. Obviously, his PR machinery was the best there has been in the world.
प्रधानमंत्री पद के ऊपर बैठा हुआ भी इंसान क्यों ना हो, कोई जनता से ऊपर नहीं होता है.
And what was remarkable was the ease at which he acted. From there, he would say that those of who are there in the south, near the Indian Ocean, I can see you there shaking your hand. Hello, how are you? And he would say something in the local language. Then he would say, I can even see people in Kashmir, and look up and point his finger as if he's waving to people in Kashmir. Such a brilliant performer, you know. I'm certain that Mr. Modi has taken acting lessons from someone. He's really learnt his job.
चल शंख उठा, चल ढोल बजा.
In 2014, during the electoral campaign for leadership of India, Modi became a pioneer of social media. To get around mass media, which he found too critical, he was backed up by an army of trolls promoting his image on internet, a daily radio broadcast, and his own television channel on YouTube.
Our job was easy because the Prime Minister was a great messenger and he also gave a great message. So all we had to do was repackage it in modern day lingo. So we used things from cartoons, we used memes, we used caricatures. So each platform, like I said, has its own different quality.
His campaign was one of the most well-oiled machines in the world. He had almost, it seemed, bottomless supplies of cash. He deployed an army of extremely talented and technologically savvy aides across the country who built up a database, who knew how to target voters.
Modi replied to the expectations of the people by promising to fight against inequality, poverty and corruption. Above all, he broke party campaign codes by bringing his own image to the forefront.
He's a strong leader. And, so initially, very early on in his first campaign, he talked about his 56-inch chest that was strong and would, as a sign of his strength. And that image of strength, solidity, discipline, almost godlike powers is one that has been manufactured and multiplied and disseminated endlessly.
I will build smart cities. I will clean the Ganges. I will make India into something resembling a first world country, perhaps even a superpower. Give me that opportunity. He is an ideologue, but most importantly, he is a narcissist. He loves to project himself. He believes in himself. He sees himself as an agent of destiny.
This is a typical electoral campaign by Narendra Modi. It's about playing with emotions, with images, and avoiding all of what you might call the concrete aspects of public politics. He has no genuine interest in the economy, in finance. That's not what he's there for.
On the 10th of June 2014, at the age of 63, Narendra Modi finally achieved his goal when he was elected to lead India. He would now be able to implement his program. Modi promised to make the country the second world power behind China and to set off to conquer the world. Modi made his first appearance on the world stage as a pacifist and spiritual leader on the 21st of June 2015. He had succeeded his first step in his quest to make India shine out across the world. An international Yoga Day to be held all over the planet each year on the 21st of June.
अंतर्राष्ट्रीय योग दिवस से न सिर्फ एक दिवस मनाने का प्रारंभ हो रहा है, लेकिन शांति, सद्भावना, इस ऊंचाइयों को प्राप्त करने के लिए
Leading 20,000 people in yoga is not about yoga, it's about spectacle, right? Yoga is not in its essence about contorting your body into exercise, right? So it's a very personal thing. It is not a drill, a mass drill that you see in totalitarian regimes.
While in India, the Prime Minister's opponents denounced a costly communication exercise and the proselytizing of Hinduism, Modi made his mark abroad as the world's guru, with millions of faithful all around the planet united almost simultaneously in Berlin, Kabul, New York, Paris, Sydney. A hugely influential operation on an international scale.
When he's abroad, especially in Western democracies, he likes to be seen as one of the group of democratic leaders bearing the burden of the world.
Of course, there's a soft diplomacy aspect to it. When you do yoga, however you do it, whatever your way of practicing it, just remember that this is something which started off in India. And it just leaves you feeling happy about India.
With this federal event, Modi had kept his promise of restoring national pride to the people of India. He also won back confidence from the West in record time and acquired a special place at the table of the superpowers. Behind his spiritual leader mask, Modi is also an army leader who wants to turn India into a frontline military power. As soon as he arrived in power, he organised a great demonstration of strength by the Indian Navy to discourage his two historical enemy neighbours, Pakistan and China, but also in order to initiate negotiations with the Western superpowers prepared to support his military ambitions. Because since the hegemonic increase in strength of China, much attention was focused on India. A discreet alliance of the world's greatest superpowers was wooing Modi. The Indo-Pacific Alliance, created on the initiative of the Japanese and Americans alongside Australians to counter Chinese expansionism in the Pacific.
The Indo-Pacific is where the future of the global system, the global economy will be written. It's India's near neighborhood. It's fundamental to Indian prosperity because so much of our trade depends on the waters of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. It's fundamental to our security.
Why should we care about India? It's a great question. It's developed in the last decade into one of the world's superpowers, the third economy on Earth, and increasingly, when the West used to think we could solve global problems just if the US and Europe could agree. Well, that's no longer the case.
The only counterweight to China with sufficient power, at least in military terms, is India, including from the so-called Indo-Pacific viewpoint, this famous geopolitical concept which stretches from Ormuz to Malacca and whose vocation is to contain Chinese expansion in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific Ocean.
To reinforce Indian strength within the region between the Indian and Pacific Oceans and create a joint resistance force, the Indo-Pacific Alliance made Modi the proposition of intensifying their military training and strengthening their position in the region.
Prime Minister Modi came into power at a moment when India was ready to take that role, and he has grasped it firmly. And it's made a big difference. There are now military exercises between those two great powers, and although nobody says it, clearly it's a warning to China. America has wanted India to come out of its shell, to be the leader in the region that it's starting to step up to be a good partner to the West.
As a participant in the Indo-Pacific Alliance, Modi attempted to fight against Chinese encirclement of the Silk Road and the installation of ports and naval bases along the Indian coast.
There is something that Chinese call their chain of pearls, of not quite bases, but ports where they can get materiel for their Navy ships and for their commercial ships. And India sees this with real concern because a lot of those ports are right around their borders, into Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka. You have them doing a lot of building in Pakistan. They famously now have a military base in Djibouti. And people in the region, especially India, sees this with trepidation. So what are they doing? Understandably, they're looking for friends.
Modi therefore turned towards ports and military bases of the Americans, Japanese, and increasingly the French as a means of support in developing his own positions. Despite the smiling facade between Narendra Modi and the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, built-up tensions were worsening between the two Asiatic giants. The most important line of conflict was to be found at the summit of the Himalayas, at a height of 4,000 meters along their joint border, over some 3,380 kilometers. On the 16th of June 2020, Modi was visiting Ladakh, one of the most sensitive zones, claimed by both of the nuclear powers, where Indian and Chinese soldiers were face to face. A violent clash had just taken place, and for the first time since 1975, the Indian army had suffered 20 victims. Chinese figures were not released.
Increasingly, you see what in the US we call a salami slicing strategy, where the Chinese will do their exercises and they'll come closer and closer to territory that the Indians think is clearly theirs. And this spring, you saw an extreme version of that in Ladakh. And just this week, we've had 20 Indians killed on that border. So it's a very dangerous situation, and it's really woken India up to the threat.
Amongst the Indian soldiers who died in the skirmishes, there was a colonel, at least one high-ranking soldier. What's more, these confrontations were not with firearms, because under the terms of the protocol signed in 93 to 96, firing shots was forbidden. Consequently, the Chinese used cudgels wrapped in barbed wire, and the families retrieved the bodies in particularly harrowing conditions.
भारत माता की भारत माता के दुश्मनों ने आपकी फायर हुई देखी है और आपकी फ्यूरी भी.
Since the Chinese victory over India in the 1962 war, India and China have never managed to come to agreement over their joint borders, which they redraw to their respective advantage and according to their own interpretation of history. Each country has its own map with different frontiers. And since 1962, Chinese and Indian soldiers regularly accuse each other of incursions and step up their provocations within the disputed zones.
The origin of the dispute in the Himalayas between India and China go back 100 years, maybe longer, because historically India and China were two large civilizations or civilizational states perhaps at various points in their history with buffer zones. The buffer zones didn't always get defined to mutual satisfaction. We have one perception, they obviously have another perception. They are on territory that we see as Indian territory.
These are major differences. It's not just a few kilometres in a couple of border zones. We are talking about hundreds of square kilometres which are disputed. And what's more, which pose diplomatic problems. When someone coming from the state of Arunachal Pradesh asks for a visa to enter China, they are told it's not necessary because they are in a region which the Chinese consider Chinese.
The Chinese criticise Modi for beginning the construction of a network of some 60 strategic roads over the length of the contested region. Since the bloody incidents of June 2020, the two countries have sent tens of thousands of soldiers and weapons close to the border as reinforcements. Satellite images show a sharp increase in military deployment on both sides of the border. New roads and training camps, warships, missiles and heliports are clearly apparent.
It's not an international boundary, it's not a recognized frontier, but it's a tentative boundary. In recent years, and again, the Narendra Modi government has pushed this, the Indian government, the Indian system has also ramped up building infrastructure on our side of the line of actual control. Chinese infrastructure is still well ahead, because they've been doing it for decades. But our infrastructure is slowly catching up. That is also enhancing our capacities to patrol. And this is sometimes leading to complications.
The Indians saying to their soldiers, don't shoot, but also not backing down, which I think is not quite what the Chinese expected. At the same time, India is also increasing its defense budgets every year and buying more modern military technology from the West and elsewhere.
My colonel just want to tell you one word. Yeah, okay. Tell the two commanders, go back right now. Go back right now.
While China criticizes India for its rapprochement with the United States and intensifies its border controls, there are growing anti-Chinese feelings in India. Narendra Modi has suspended some of the most popular Chinese applications, and his intelligence services accuse China of pirating his social media accounts. In order to find his place in the new world order, Modi is cultivating relations with a historic military partner, Israel, and makes no secret of his affinity with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
And whenever India found itself in trouble, be it against China, be it against Pakistan, Israelis gave covert support to India in the form of arms.
India matters for Israel and Israel matters for India. Traditionally, many in India felt that you could pursue good relations with the Arab world or with the Israelis, but not with both. Prime Minister Modi believes that you could do both.
Modi's visit to Israel was momentous for the simple reason that no other prime minister dared to do it for fear of upsetting Arab opinion. I think it was also, to some extent, a way of showing up his opposition in India, telling them that, you've been profiting from Israeli assistance for so long, but you've never had the guts to embrace Israel openly. Let me show you how it's done.
As well as the military affinity, Modi shares a certain ideological affinity with the State of Israel.
Hindu nationalists look to Israel as a model, as a country to admire, as a pole star. They see Israel surviving and thriving in a sea of hostility. It's surrounded by Arab Muslim countries that hate Israel, and yet Israel manages to survive. Not only survive, but prosper, and has never lost a war to them. And they've always wanted India to emulate the Israeli pluck in dealing with its own adversaries in Pakistan.
Strengthened by new international respectability and his achievements, Narendra Modi is preparing to restore India's past glory and bring about his ideal of a Hindu state. On the 4th of August 2020 in Ayodhya, Modi finally accomplished his mission in a historic ceremony after a century-long battle between Hindus and Muslims for this sacred place. Modi laid the first stone of the temple which is to replace the mosque destroyed 28 years ago by Hindu fundamentalists. This is the second act of the Nationalist revenge program which Modi is playing out, a symbol of the victory of Hinduism over Islam in India.
For 60 years, we continued fighting because some groups wanted a temple, some groups wanted a masjid. There had to be a closure to this. How can you build new things without healing wounds of the past?
With this historic victory, Narendra Modi brings to an end centuries of Hindu frustration and thereby responds to Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire who built the mosque 500 years ago, probably after the destruction of a pre-existing Hindu temple.
In India, we never really dealt with that past. And Ayodhya became a symbol of that unremembered past. People looked at the ruin, the mosque there, and they said, how did this mosque come to be? The local memory, there's a lot of local memory that says that there was a temple that stood on that site, which was raised by the founder, by one of the lieutenants of the founder of the Mughal Empire, and in its place a mosque was erected.
Since Modi's coming to power, Hindu nationalists have undertaken the removal of traces of other cultures, in particular the heritage of Muslim invasions, to conserve only Hindu history.
We see the promotion of Hinduism in history books, for example, which are rewritten in a way which magnifies Hindu antiquity. On the other hand, the Muslim invasions are demonized. They are depicted as victims of campaigns of discrimination, of segregation, with accusations of Hindu girls being seduced and married, then converted. There are accusations of the slaughtering of cows, highly sacred animals in Hinduism, when they were simply being led from the market to a farm. In the meantime, they were victims of violence or lynchings.
At the end of 2019, the nationalist machine was working flat out. Modi continued the fulfilling of radical promises made to Hindus. A few months after regaining Kashmir, then winning the Battle of the Temple, he modified the criteria for access to Indian nationality. and succeeded in passing through Parliament a law aiming to exclude Muslims.
The Citizenship Amendment Act, this law which amends the access to citizenship, for the first time recognises religion as one of the criteria.
Imagine you're a Muslim living in some part of India. Someone will knock on your door and say to you, prove that you're a citizen of India. How do you prove citizenship in India? Have you been to remote corners of India? People don't have food to eat. It is a horror show.
With this law, which affirms the primacy of Hindus, Modi achieved the Nationalist revenge program undertaken in 2014. But he also set off vast contestation demonstrations. Throughout India, people are taking action to support Muslims and demand the repeal of the law.
The protesters who have gone up against Modi are not praising Pakistan, are not saying we want to destroy India, are not enemies of India as the Prime Minister would like to portray them. They are people, their song is the national anthem of India. Their standard is the Indian flag, and their holy book is the Indian Constitution.
In the Muslim quarter of New Delhi, democratic demonstrations turn into violent riots between extremist Hindus and Muslims. In February 2020, these riots caused more than 50 deaths and hundreds of injured.
Human rights activists, NGO workers, even politicians from the opposition have found themselves behind bars. It's not been easy to stand up and speak against this government.
For the longest time, people wondered what a Hindu state would look like. It looks the way it currently does. Its economy has cratered. There is a calamitous joblessness crisis. Minorities are being told in so many ways that they cannot be full Indians, and Parliament and autonomous institutions surrounding him have caved. This is pretty much what a Hindu nation looks like.
India can sleep easily, and the human rights abuses which it has carried out on its territory haven't yet been put in question, at least not officially.
In the world of diplomats, especially career diplomats, there is a lot of concern about this particular Hindu nationalist direction that the Prime Minister and his administration are taking. However, just concern behind the scenes doesn't change anyone's behavior. It needs to really come from the top levels. It needs to come from the state. It needs to come from the head of state in Germany, in France, in the UK, in the United States, hopefully as a united front.